you, and thank you to all of our attendees. Glad you could make it here for this interesting conversation. Wrapping up this series. First, a quick thanks to Financial Voice sponsors. You can learn more of them in the materials that should be available to you as part of your entry into this presentation. Quick disclaimer, while we may have lawyers and financial professionals as part of this presentation and discussion, you are not getting any official legal or financial advice from any of us. This is meant to be educational, and no specific client relationship is established by us providing this information. Without further ado, I actually think I'll flip it over to each of our panelists to give themselves a brief introduction, because they are better suited to do so than I am. So first introducing Larry Florio. Larry.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Larry Florio. I'm general counsel at 1KX, which is a crypto-focused investment fund.
Thanks, Larry. Michael.
Hey, thanks, David. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Hiles. I'm founder, CEO of 10XTS, an asset tokenization solutions provider.
Thanks, Michael. And last but certainly not least, sure. You are on.
Thank you, David. My name is Richard Johnson. I'm the founder and CEO of Texture Capital. We are a SEC and FINRA regulated broker-dealer focused on the tokenization of securities. We help clients raise capital through digital securities offerings, and we have an ATS to enable secondary trading.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thrilled to have all three of these folks here with us today. As I mentioned, wrap up this series earlier in the year. We had the idea of digital assets collateral, and speaking about digital assets relates to bankruptcy. And so here we're speaking more as it relates to securities and how they are treated, digital assets are treated, and what the implications are of that, and what we see things looking like going forward. To provide a little bit of background and level setting for our attendees, looking at some of the things you might hear us say, providing some common language. Two of the major and main securities laws at the federal level in the United States are the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. So we're talking about the 33 Act or the 34 Act. That's what we're talking about. And the Supreme Court case, SEC v. Howey, that talks about whether or not something that doesn't fit cleanly within categorization as a security should be treated as one. And so if we talk about the Howey test, that's what we're talking about there. And there are a number of different agencies that touch on digital assets, and in particular in moments where they're treated as securities. So a few of those might include the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, the CFTC, and FINRA. So again, further level setting, because this is a technical space and this is a technical conversation, whether we want it to be or not, talking about what are we talking about when we're talking about digital assets? What are we talking about in terms of different sorts of digital assets, and what are these transactions? Fundamentally, what is happening here? And we're not going to get super in depth with the technical functions and form of blockchains and distributed ledgers. But we will say here, when we're talking about digital assets, we're talking about representations of either a store of value or other points of reference on a blockchain or a distributed ledger of some sort. We might be talking about cryptocurrencies, which people might recognize things like Bitcoin or Ethereum. We might be talking about things that are directly a security token or a digital asset security, which is explicitly called out as being a traditional security, such as a stock or bond. You now have more and more folks talking about, and we'll get to this later in our conversation, talking about the tokenization of assets. So we have real world assets that are being represented in a digital form. And these interplay with one another through what are commonly referred to as things like smart contracts. So self-executing bits of code that people can interact with on decentralized networks in order to affect a number of different kinds of transactions in a variety of different ways. So clearly, because of the nature of this conversation, this is an area of constant change and flux and a bit of ambiguity. And so I figured we would begin our conversation today with a very simple, should only take us just a moment question. Are digital assets securities? And Clearly, there's been no ambiguity on this at all. So I expect that Larry will be able to give us a very clean answer, and it should just take us just a minute. So Larry, let's start with you.
Sure.
Digital asset securities?
Sometimes.
It depends.
It does depend. Yeah, I'm sorry for everyone listening. That there's gonna be a lot of lawyerly answers, like maybe and it depends on this one. I think that it's better to think about digital assets as really more of a form of asset rather than a type of asset. I think there are certainly some tokens that are securities, whether intentionally or unintentionally, but I think there are plenty of examples that are also not securities as well.
And Michael, from your perspective, and we gave very brief introductions, but of the folks that are participating today, you are the most technical from a software and coding perspective. So from that perspective, as somebody who is a builder of things involving and essential to digital assets, how would you respond to an assertion that we might get from a regulatory agency that these assets are inherently in and of themselves securities?
The perennial debate. So I would agree with Larry that it depends. We have to take a step back even outside of the legal construct and the technical construct and the financial construct, and let's go to philosophy. And let's talk about abstraction and semantics. What is a token? A token is a representation of something else, right? And so what are the semantics and the definition of the application of that token into a bigger construct? So taking it into the legal world, which of course semantics are very important. It's really the definitions that are encapsulated in things like contracts and laws and the words that are represented of the the intent to codify behavior and activities and actions. In the tech world, of course, representation is data, right? It's something that signifies or represents something else. So if I'm using a representation in a data format that is an actual security in the real world, then by the nature of that digital twin, it becomes a security in that data environment, or vice versa. If it's not something that's a security in the real world, then it's typically not going to be a security in the data world. Now, that's a rational viewpoint, and let's just say that regulators and attorneys will debate ad nauseum on the efficacy of what I just stated. But as a philosopher, as a data architect and a data analyst, that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
And Richard, do you agree with the other esteemed panelists here that context is critical, or for purposes of thinking about it as somebody who has the responsibilities of being a registered broker dealer, of having these obligations placed upon you by the federal government, is this position consistent with the way that you would look at digital assets? That it depends, and some of them may fall into this category and some may not.
Yeah, well, I think that is the true answer. And there's a couple of lawyers on the call here. There's been a lot of litigation around whether that is in fact true, which all kind of goes back to a quote from the former SEC chairman Jay Clayton, which I think he said in 2017. He said, "Every ICO I've seen is a security." So he was certainly implying that all digital assets are securities. And then his successor at the SEC is Gary Gensler, who has made similar proclamations. I think in the current SEC's view, only 2 digital assets are not securities, which is Bitcoin and Ethereum, Ether. These are currently being litigated, and I think there's a lot of very strong arguments. And I think we've got an election in less than a month, and the view of the regulators may change shortly after that. From my point of view, as a regulated broker dealer, all we touch are digital securities, are actual securities. So that can be equity, that could be fixed income, that could be funds. So that's the world we work in. And then you mentioned the Howey test. There's some prongs to that, whether it's an investment of money, work is done on behalf of others with an expectation of profit, for example. These are some of the characteristics of what represents securities. So it is it is certainly a challenging environment, I would say. There's been some cases where the SEC has lost. For example, I think Ripple, where they alleged that XRP was a security, and the court ruled that XRP, the token, is not the security, but the actual contract that represents is the securities contract. So there's an awful lot of nuance here. But I think if, in a way, we have an advantage as a broker-dealer. We're just sticking with the ones that we know are definitely securities.
Yeah, I think that segues nicely into this next slide and in furtherance of what Michael was saying, so that you have instances where you have digital assets that securities in, securities out. So you have a tokenization or a different representation of an asset that might be deemed quote unquote true security or a traditional security. And once we're in that space, there are a number of different intermediaries that are essential to, we can debate whether or not they're essential to, but that are inherent to, your securities markets. You have the issuers, people who are selling their securities, whether it's a corporation or some other kind of entity. You have investment banks, exchanges, broker dealers like Texture, clearinghouses, custodians, transfer agents, lots of different players in the space that serve different purposes in order to affect transactions and to maintain an orderly market. So as we're looking at, and then again, limiting our universe to these traditional securities represented in a new way, what ways do we see looking on the horizon for blockchain technology or digital assets or decentralized ledgers in different ways to perhaps reduce reliance on intermediaries, or change the way that intermediaries interplay with their customers? And for this one, I think we'll start with Richard.
Yeah, well, this is a bit of a tough question for me because we are technically an intermediary. We're a broker-dealer here. But I think there are ways we can streamline the whole process. I'm thinking about smart contracts here, having the blockchain as a source of truth. And I think maybe to take a step back, fundamentally, I think what the key innovation in blockchain was its ability to provide a new way for a transfer of value, harnessing the digital distributed ledger. And when you think about capital markets, nearly everything that goes on in capital markets is about a transfer of value, whether it's you're transferring risk, or transferring money in exchange for securities, or you're doing reconciliation between all the various different banks. So that's where I think the real advantages come in. You're able to have a ledger that multiple different banks can look at, or different trading parties can look at, so that we can confirm trades more easily, understand trades, see exposure that different counterparties may have. We can apply smart contracts to enforce rules. There are a lot of rules in the securities world. An example I like to think of is around secondary trading. So certainly in private markets, which is where a lot of the activity in digital securities is right now, there are many different rules that you look at. There's Reg A, which is more of a public offering, and there's Reg D, which I think is more common. In Regulation D, you're only allowed to sell securities to accredited investors, and they're not eligible for secondary trading until after 1 year, typically under Rule 144. And then there's another rule which is Section 12G of the Exchange Act, which limits the number of shareholders you can have. So in the old non-digital, blockchain world, how do you verify all these rules? And a very old school way, we're relying on lawyers and paralegals and other types of folks like that to verify the securities ownership and some of these other things. With a smart contract, with a blockchain, if you want to check, for example, if the person is accredited, you can have a digital ID or decentralized ID that has their KYC and accreditation status. If you want to check they've held it for more than a year before accepting an order to sell into an ATS like Textures, you can go to the blockchain record and see how long that security has been in that person's wallet. And if you want to restrict the number of shareholders from going above 2,000 and triggering 12G, again, you can look at the smart contract on the blockchain and see how many wallet holders there are. So there's a few examples of how I think we're going to have some real benefits from tokenization in capital markets.
And Larry, as you look to portfolio companies and others in the space who are building new products and building new solutions, what kind of things are you seeing and or you are excited about addressing this issue to facilitate or streamline or rethink the way that we interact with one another in capital markets and beyond?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I largely agree with what Richard said there. When I'm working with our portfolio companies, they are largely trying to stay out of having their tokens considered securities. So we have a lot of conversations about all of the features of securities that perhaps they want to avoid it when designing a product or a protocol. But I think in general, there's a lot of efficiency you can get from using blockchain simply because it is largely automated, is publicly viewable. So there's a security aspect to that where you don't have to trust that you're getting correct reporting from someone. But in a lot of ways too, I think it does create some additional challenges. Richard made the great point that if you want to see how many wallets are holding a token, you can simply check a block explorer and see that. But you don't necessarily know that it's one wallet per shareholder. I mean, there's lots of good reasons why a single investor or a single participant will have different wallets. So as like an upper bound of possible holders, I think it works well. But then it creates its own complexity if you're trying to actually determine whether a token, which is a security, let's just assume that we stipulate that it is a security, if you're trying to determine how many holders it actually has, that can actually be very difficult. There's no straightforward way at this point to consistently be able to send a message to another wallet, and certainly not one where you can be assured that they'll see it or even respond to it. So it's something that we're working through right now. I do actually think that despite blockchain technology now being over 10 years in the wild, there's a lot we're still very early days on the infrastructure here, and there's still a lot of work being done and a lot of interesting products that are being developed to solve these problems, but it's still early days on a lot of it.
Yeah, and Michael, what have you seen and what have you because you've both built and also are looking forward to building other things, what sorts of solutions are you seeing or have you seen to undermine or adjust the role of these intermediaries?
Well, the current state of blockchain is a great first generation effort. But like all first generation efforts, it fails on a number of fronts. It's wonderful experimentation. The idea of tokenization is a decade old now. The first tokenization projects happened literally in 2014 era. And so in technology life cycles, that's a couple of generations. So we're actually lagging behind, and that's due in part to the confusion and the challenge of getting a lot of complex vocabularies together to agree on things between law, finance, and technology, in particular, data. Blockchains fundamentally are actually pretty stupid. They're a terrible database. They're slow, they're inefficient, and all it is just a bunch of associations of hash values. And so then we get into the question of ascribing that semantic context of the claim and the proof that that particular hash value sitting on this blockchain actually represents a share of stock in a company. Okay, great, prove it. Well, the current models of proving it are not blockchain based. We have to go back to the human powered trust of lawyers and contracts and provability in courts of law to establish the efficacy of the claim and proof to determine whether or not that particular hash value on that ledger really means what people say that it means or are claiming that it means. And this involves a lot of extended off-chain contextual metadata. And that metadata in the instance of securities are things like the legal fictions and the philosophical idea of what is a share of stock, right? It's an equity. It's embodied in a contract that's written up by an attorney. It's a philosophical construct. And then we have artifacts that define that and make that provable. So how do we inject those artifacts into the hash value, the smart contract, the token? How do we inject identity into wallets and accounts to establish these equally immutable proofs that the claims are what they say they are, as the immutability exists for the existence of the transaction, the token, etc., on the ledger. So the disconnect between the real world and injecting that real world data into the virtual world of these hash values is really where a lot of the next generation development efforts are already underway, and where they have to be completed in order for there to be a broad-based understanding and adoption of the technology for the things that we think that it can actually do, like potentially reduce the reliance on intermediaries that are manual fact checkers for regulators who require gentlemen like Richard to ensure that everything is staying within the boundaries of the law. He has to report on that to FINRA, SEC for every transaction, every asset, every issuance, all of these things. And he's the proverbial throat to choke for the regulator to come in if there's a problem or something goes wrong. You don't have that when you have a trustless technology environment that somewhat replaces or outright replaces in some instances those types of functions. And I think that that's the next generation, and that's what we've been very active in developing and building on for the past couple of years.
Thank you. So looking now to sort of the clashing of worlds, or the colliding of worlds between the old and the new, and whether this is an attempt to shoehorn new things into an old framework, or a truly emerging that's more helpful than not. I think we can get into discussing it. We have seen traditional registered securities gain be structured in a way as to gain exposure to these emerging assets, these more novel assets. We've seen the approval of ETFs, or an exchange traded fund, that can give your regular investors, through the regular sets of intermediaries, access to digital assets that they may not have felt comfortable gaining access to before. So would that be enough? What if that's the answer here? Saying, well, we don't really need to, we just say, okay, listen, we're not sure. It depends too much on all of these things, but we know that when people in the retail markets are buying and selling things, and whenever institutional money that has restraints on it, is going to get access to it, and they're holding other grandma's pension fund, we'll sit within the framework that we have. We'll have them registered the way that they've always been registered, and then those managers will give them the authority to engage with these markets with disclosure, et cetera. Do we think that would be enough? Is that enough? Can we just hand all this over to the SEC and to other securities regulators? And I'll start with Michael on this one. I have a feeling I know a little bit where your thoughts on this, but we'll start there for now.
So back in the original era of the internet, when the web first came along, there was a scramble to figure out how to apply the technology in a lot of different industries. And I view ETFs sort of akin to a travel agent providing an email form on their website to request the purchase of a plane ticket. What we're talking about is applying existing mental models based on the way that the world has been into an entirely new revolutionary paradigm. And so I see Wall Street 1.0 really trying to fit their existing models into the emergence of the new technology. So on one hand, it's also effective because it provides broad-based exposure to retail markets, to what is otherwise a complex technology and not easy to necessarily get your hands on. On the other hand, I think it's a limited roadmap, and it has a life expectancy because, let's face it, travel agents kind of died and went by the wayside. And so the guys that remain today are the folks that rethought the integration of e-commerce and intermediary for things like travel. And I think that you're going to see a rise of that next generation of rethinking as Wall Street moves from 1.0 to 2.0, which is also reliant on regulators moving from regulation 1.0 to regulation 2.0 as well. And so they're kind of hand in glove issues, but I don't think as it sits today, it's a sufficient solution. It solves the problem that people are looking for, liquidity, accessibility, those kinds of things, but it's not the long tail solution.
I think it transitions nicely into asking Richard when Michael talks about the transition from Wall Street 1.0 to Wall Street 2.0. I think that someone I would point like, well, what's an example of Wall Street 2.0 of traditional intermediaries looking forward? I would point to you and to Texture and to those that are looking to be licensed to deal with digital asset securities. And so I'll ask you the same question. Do you think that we are in a situation where we can deal with either registered or just fully exempt securities transactions, and within the existing framework, will that be enough to handle or to appropriately accommodate the changes that we've seen in the digital economy?
Okay, so I'm going to have a bit of a multi-pronged answer to this one, but I think the premise of your question is suggesting, well, we can get Ether and Bitcoin in an ETF now, so do we need to hold the underlying asset directly? And I'd say the answer to that is this is a huge benefit for a lot of people who don't want to deal with opening up a crypto account and managing their wallets, or having a crypto custodian, or whatever it is. For these top two assets, and maybe it's going to be Solana is going to be the next one, we'll see. But it's taken 10 years, 9 years, I think, since for the Bitcoin ETF to come through. There's a slow process going from the launch of a digital asset, and then it eventually getting approved by the SEC to go into one of these more traditional wrappers. So I think for that's one reason. I think you also lose a lot of the benefits that you have when you're interacting with digital assets directly, such as, for example, using it in a lending protocol, being able to lend to earn some yield on it by lending out your assets, which you can't really do in traditional markets as well. And then I think that's kind of my first part of the answer to the question. The second part is this is not this is the digital assets that you're defining on this slide is the, let's say, golden crypto digital assets. There's also what I'm talking about, which I spend most of my day working on, which is the tokenization of real world assets, as the term is, or RWA. And so then we see that there's a lot of tokenized money market funds out there that are serving, they are very nascent, and they are kind of, I guess, MVPs in the tokenization world, but they are serving a purpose. A couple of use cases. I'm not entirely sure what the audience is for this, but there's Benji, which is Franklin Mutual, they've tokenized some money market funds, and part of their goal is to have, through their Benji app, is to have people be able to send the Benji token from one user to another. We're doing that with Venmo today and things like that. The advantage being that it's earning a yield. So you're able to send a yield-bearing asset to pay for dinner or whatever. So there's some benefits there. And then I think going up on the other end of the scale, there's institutional benefits to having these types of securities tokenized. And that is kind of collateral, let's call it collateral mobility. So in large transactions such as repo, in between banks, money has to be moved around a lot on Wall Street, and there's a lot of reconciliation that happens. I spoke about that. And we've got a system on Wall Street that's been built up over the last 50 years with technology layered on technology layered on technology, essentially. And what we have an opportunity to do here is to really create a new way of moving capital around within capital markets. And then I'd say the final part of my answer here is, are we building 2.0, Wall Street 2.0? That's absolutely what we're trying to do here at Texture. And I think a good example, and maybe I'll throw this back to Michael a little bit, is one thing we haven't talked about, but is kind of goes back to his throat to choke comment, which I liked very much. The SEC is required for tokenized securities. The SEC is requiring that there is a transfer agent who maintains the official books and records. So they're still a little bit wary about the blockchain being the ultimate record of ownership. And then we've got folks like 10xTX, which is Michael's company, being a digital transfer agent, And I'd love to hear, what his thoughts are on that and how we transition from the traditional transfer agent role to a digital transfer agent, where we kind of have a better technology for doing these types of things.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and I think we get around to talking about transfer agents at some point. If we don't, we should definitely have a conversation about that. Looking at, clearly these things are not as straightforward as we jokingly referred to them in the beginning, saying like, oh yeah, clearly this is going to be one thing or another. Clearly this is going to be the transition. Transition and change is difficult, and there have been some presses or attempts, whether in good faith or not, of the legislature in the US, of regulators to give some form of guidance, some form of regulatory framework, and how effective it has been or not been is certainly up for debate. But do we think that in the upcoming future, or the near future, the midterm future, the long-term future, there will be, and for purpose of this question, let's say within just the US, where we're all based, a comprehensive regulatory framework to deal with digital assets, to deal with the nuances that we're digging into, and to create an environment where we're not losing some of our brightest builders to foreign jurisdictions? And I'll start with Larry on this one.
We will absolutely get a regulatory framework for digital assets. I think the when is a bit more of an open question than the if, and perhaps the biggest open question is whether anyone is happy with what we get. But on some level, I think that having known rules to a game, even if you don't like those rules, is tremendously helpful. When I'm speaking to founders in the space, no one's looking to evade regulations. Everyone's opens up the conversation with me saying that they want to comply, they want to understand this, they want to do this the right way. And I have the unfortunate task of explaining to them that there is no right way or to comply with rules in the United States right now, because we lack that framework. An important point here, though, I think, is that the SEC could today issue guidance and create regulations that do this. They're not, which is why I think we're seeing, and I say SEC, but this goes as well for the CFTC and other regulators. They could create specific rules for digital assets now, but they haven't. They insist that the current frameworks work for digital assets, which I really don't think they do. And that's why we're seeing all these legislative initiatives here. The trouble with that, and sorry, before I go ahead there, I want to make a point about ETFs, because we touched on those a bit ago. Every ETF actually has to apply for exemptive relief before it can be publicly traded. So there is well-known history with the SEC of providing exemptions, providing guidance, creating new frameworks itself when existing rules and frameworks don't apply well to novel assets, whether that's ETFs, asset-backed securities. They've created new reporting guidelines, new structures, new forms that are more appropriate for these types of products. They just simply haven't done so for digital assets to this point. I personally don't actually think that the SEC or the CFTC should be the primary regulator for digital assets writ large. I think actually that something like the FTC would be much more suitable, because a digital asset, like we've talked a bit here about, isn't fundamentally a financial instrument simply because it's a digital asset. It's just a mode of storing and transferring rights or value. So I think that fundamentally that is a commercial, that is a trade action, not a financial action. The CFTC should absolutely regulate commodity derivatives and futures. The SEC should absolutely regulate securities and securities transactions. But I don't think that glomming all of digital assets, I mean, you have a tokenized collectible, like a Pokemon card or a pair of sneakers or what have you. It doesn't make any sense to me to have the SEC or the CFTC regulating that when it doesn't change its nature. And I think Michael made this point earlier, simply digitizing something or tokenizing something doesn't change the fundamental character of what that thing is.
Michael, do you agree that the process of digitization does not change the essence of the thing that has been digitized, going back to the question of inputs versus outputs?
Yeah, I actually do agree. I think we've got very robust securities laws in this nation. I think we have very robust banking laws. I think we have very robust consumer protection laws. And I think what we're talking about is the application of new technologies that mostly conform to those laws. And that's why we start with the law and work our way backwards, as opposed to let's create something new and then try to beat a square peg in a round hole, way back when we started the company. I think the real sandbox that needs to happen for innovation is how do these regulatory agencies intersect with the technology? So in the instance where there is a, say, tokenized ETF or a tokenized derivative, the appropriate regulatory construct can be injected directly into that digital instrument as a function of a digital regulatory environment. So rather than focusing outwards on the rest of the market, I would personally like to see agencies and the innovators at these agencies and Congress get together and say, well, hey, this is an opportunity to actually upgrade government and how we regulate in this digital environment. We have a responsibility to also adopt these technologies for these things. And I think you'll find that if we start to explore that discussion, that's actually where a lot of the breakdown is occurring. A token, even if it's sold as a result of a security offering, i.e. an investment contract, just under same under Howey, I've said this and I've heard other attorneys say it, the oranges didn't somehow or another permanently inherit the attributes of the security of the sale contract. The oranges were still oranges. And I think that's a fundamental concept that we have to get our heads around, but it's going to take a comprehensive tech-savvy legislature that understands these things so that they don't go in and codify technology into the law. They continue to codify behavior and intent into the law because technology is always going to change in advance. What exists today is not going to exist in 30 years. It's going to evolve, but the law never does, right? So the point being, that I think that where we need to really spend our time and focusing on is defining an agreed upon taxonomy, an agreed upon ontology of these things so that the regulators can go and do their part with that common vocabulary. The technology people can do their part with that common vocabulary. The lawyers can do their part with that common vocabulary. Intermediaries like Richard can do their part. And everybody is singing from the same hymnal. And I sat in Congressman Warren Davidson's office in 2018, and that's when we hammered out the very first blockchain federal bill that was adopted on the floor of the Financial Services Committee, was introduced for the Token Taxonomy Act. And that was the point. Start there with that foundation, and then the rest of it will sort itself out as we go forward.
Richard, how about you? Do you feel that we are making progress towards a comprehensive regulatory framework, or are we stuck somewhere in regulatory purgatory?
Yeah, I mean, both, I think. Both answers are true there. We're making progress, but it has been regulatory purgatory. You met with Warren Davidson in 2018, for example, and here we are. We're still waiting for some, not even a comprehensive regulatory framework, but some kind of framework. And it's going to start with probably stable coins. I'm losing track of all the different bills that have been out there, but stable coins seems like the one that the regulators understand most, the legislators, our representatives understand the most. And it has some use cases I think they understand, obviously around payments and so forth. So I think it's going to be tough to get to a comprehensive regulatory framework given all the different vested interests that there are on Capitol Hill. And I'm gonna this isn't, and there's another problem I think we have in the United States that is not just for digital assets, is that we have too many regulators. I don't know why you have one regulator for, the CFTC for futures and commodities, and you have another one for the SEC for securities. It makes no sense. They've been kind of fighting over it. Who's got the best crypto policy or the worst crypto policy? And I think it's expensive, and I think it's doing a bad job of protecting consumers. And I think it just confuses, everyone. So I would actually advocate, merging of probably certainly the CFTC and the SEC, and possibly the OCC as well, which covers banking, because this technology spans across all of them. That's the thing. And they're trying to regulate different parts of it, and it doesn't work when they've got their own little fiefdoms.
You're trying to tell me that this hasn't been a smooth ride? I mean, yeah, following up on what all of you were just pointing out, I mean, this has been, for anybody who's worked in the space for any amount of time, and I've been fortunate enough to have almost my entire legal career has been working in Web3, starting in 2016 when I was a law clerk without a law license, just getting to learn about these things. And so seeing, for those who are coming in now or coming in more recently, giving that little bit of history of the frustration that I'm sure any attendees can hear from myself and from the panelists. This has been up and down for a long time. And we had folks initially thinking about how to raise capital in the form of digital assets, and have the ICO, the initial coin offering, thinking through different kinds of instruments that could be leveraged to affect these. When you have the SAF, the simple agreement for future tokens, when that was the form du jour, we then saw a tremendous regulatory crackdown by the SEC, looking into 2018, 2019. We then see a resurgence in the market, but people are seeing the excitement about new and exciting implementations of the technology in different configurations, looking at DeFi or looking at NFTs, non-fungible tokens, different forms and ways of representing things on chain. Again, our new resurgence, coupling that with the pandemic, lots and lots of eyes with nowhere else to look than their respective screens. And again, we have an industry that is evolving and growing and kicking and breaking into new space, being met with resistance in the form of enforcement actions, of just follow the rules as the primary form of feedback. And it has been less than helpful, I think would be a gentle way of saying it. And so we go through, again, 3 whole slides of just trying to get through just a blink of the eye in terms of actual time that has passed. Well, it feels like a lifetime since Michael pointed to 2018. So 2018 to 2024 has not been that long, but has felt like an entire life cycle for lots of folks. So, and I'd like to dedicate our the bulk of the rest of our time here talking about what's next. What do we see coming down the pipeline? Good, bad. What is there hope for the future? Are we all just planning on moving to the BVI, or what's next for us and for the industry and for digital assets in particular, when they are explicitly securities, so that we stay on topic there. And I'll let Richard kick it off for this round of discussion.
Well, what's next is an election on November 5th, which will determine to a certain extent what the regulatory policy is going to be like and what the future is going to be like. I guess the good thing is we'll be moving away from the kind of the Biden administration, which was not particularly friendly towards the space. I think they didn't really understand it. And I think it's going to be better whichever of the other 2 candidates win. So that, I think, will drive forward some innovation, some more regulation. But I always say is that, when I speak to people, having been in the space a while, I said, listen, we have a path to move forward. It's a narrow path, but we can move forward here. And that's what we're doing here at Texture and with some of our other partners in the industry. So we're seeing some interesting things and I think what's, on the retail side of things, I mentioned the kind of the Benji and some folks are beginning to get some kind of securities representation, which they can hold in their own wallet. So a lot of the Gen Z types of investors maybe have grown up only more with the digital wallet type of things, and now they can have crypto next to their S&P 500 index fund, or both tokenized in their wallet. So we're moving in that direction soon. And I think what's most positive from my point of view is the institutional movement that has started elsewhere. It started in Singapore, it started in Europe with tokenization projects for the government of Singapore and for the European Investment Bank and so forth. And I think what we're going to see in 2020, maybe late 24, but certainly in 25, some very major moves within the US of larger institutions issuing more things, trading more things, leveraging blockchain technology.
Thank you. Michael, let's tell us the future, please.
Well, I'll gaze into my crystal ball here. I know you want a securities focus. We actually stepped away from securities for a little while and started to address some other fundamental problems around the concept of just tokenization in general. And that really is moving below blockchain. And so we've been working heavily on a project that's based on the data that goes into the blockchain. So it's the data before the blockchain that goes into the blockchain to define all of these things. And so having a distributed ledger as opposed to tokens that is an advanced temporal ledger system that not only defines the asset itself, but unbundles the rights under property law away from those asset definitions, so that now there's a complete picture into the legal construct of the right of ownership, the right of possession, the right of use, the right of destruction. It's taught in every law school in the world, right, for your property law classes. And that's step one to really identifying and unbundling whether this thing is a security, whether it's commodity, whether it's just a digital, digital instrument, a utility token. The recognition and the definition of the rights and the obligations separately away from that existence of that asset are going to be paramount going forward. And then injecting that information into a traditional layer one blockchain through an advanced Oracle solution that is more of a standardized solution. We've got a lot of problems, and I could spend an entire college semester talking about the problems from the combination of these things. But once you start to solve that integration problem between the regulatory, between these taxonomical definitions, some of these things, I think that that's going to be important, because you're already seeing the next generation rise of decentralized physical infrastructure networks, DPINs. And in fact, we're building a DPIN based on the ledger system. And that really is the tokenization of everything. When you start talking about tokenizing core infrastructure, things like cloud services and mesh networks and energy networks, at a fundamental layer, that's already an advanced conversation. It might sound new to folks. They're like, what's a DPIN, right? But it's been around for a little bit when you look at the past projects like Filecoin, Helium, et cetera. And that's advancing into physical infrastructure in the real world across multiple industries. And I think that that's going to be an important stepping stone into really, I think, where we're going, because you also have the convergence and the development and the advancement and the convergence of AI. And ultimately, how do AI agents pay for things between each other? How do AI agents understand how to move assets back and forth without humans involved at all, when we're talking about just computational systems that conduct advanced trading scenarios, for example? And how does the money move? How do assets move? How do rights and obligations, how do these things move when there isn't even a human clicking a button saying buy now, right? These things all have to be mapped out and converged. And it kind of goes back to that digital government component. Until we actually have regulatory that is automated around these concepts, that we're still going to be somewhat limited.
Larry, what's next?
So we will start getting some regulatory clarity here. I think I think we've touched on a little bit. the likely lowest hanging fruit there is stablecoins. They're, especially fiat collateralized stablecoins, are fairly straightforward to understand. They clearly have a use case. They have product market fit. You just look at the market caps for the most popular ones, and you see how wide adoption for these things is. Beyond that, I think we will get regulations for digital assets in the United States. Like I sort of alluded to earlier, I don't think that we're going to particularly like how those rules look to start with, but I also do think that having just clear rules is a good starting point. We can iterate on it from there. And we do have a history of being able to, historically at least, legislate and adjust as things need adjusting. I hope, and Richard sort of, I think, commented on the number of regulators we have for financial markets in the United States. I hope that at some point in the medium term, at least, we can get a self-regulatory organization for digital assets, an SRO, ideally one that has delegation from multiple different agencies. To the point about how many regulators we have for the markets and financial services in the United States, it's difficult to have a cohesive framework no matter who's the quote unquote primary regulator when there's so many regulators. We need to have a single point of, if not contact for the industry, at least a single point of context for regulation in the United States on this. It's a very complex technology that we have. And I think we also need, to that point, allow regulators to actually use and engage with crypto themselves. It's actually a very hands-on technology. You can understand it from a technical and technological perspective, but until you've actually tried to move value around on chain and interact with some protocols, it's difficult to fully grasp how it works. And by and large, the US regulators are prohibited from holding any crypto, which by default sort of makes them unable to participate or understand crypto at all, versus they do have the ability to hold certain stocks, certain bonds, index funds, things like that. So we have regulators that are currently regulating a space that are prohibited from actually developing a better hands-on understanding of how that works. I think that will solve itself. I think that's not short-term, but we'll get there. I think we'll also, like everyone else has said, I think we'll also continue to get more institutional adoption, which I think is great. Starting with things that are clear. Securities, I think, is a perfect entry point into digital assets and how blockchain technology works. It's a known quantity for these large banks and asset managers that have been dealing with these things for decades. And I think once they start to see the efficiency and speed and flexibility of digital assets and blockchain, they're going to start finding more and more ways to integrate that into their business, not just issuing tokenized securities, but how that can help with their internal operations as well. So I don't know if that's short term, but it feels pretty inevitable to me.
Thank you. And to our facilitator, do we have any questions from any attendees that we could turn to now when we have a few minutes left in our hour? Hearing and seeing none, I will instead use this time to hear a little bit more about our panelists, who were very gracious in providing their time here and in providing extremely brief introductions. And so as part of our outro and use of the last few minutes here, go through here and let folks do a little more of explaining who you are, what you do, and where people can find you if they want to learn more. And I'll start with you, Richard.
Oh, thanks, David. Yeah, so I am I've been in capital markets almost 30 years, I suppose, 25 years. Started in a more quantitative research role. I moved to the States in 2000 and began working in equity trading, specifically in equity electronic trading. What I liked about that space at the time was very early and there wasn't a lot of electronic trading going on. And we saw a lot of growth coming out of the area. So I've always been kind of fascinated by the intersection of technology and markets, which I guess is how which led me into crypto and digital assets around 2014, and fairly early, which is good timing, I suppose. But also, it was very early. There's a lot. I worked for a couple of startups, and it was I wanted to come at it from a trading point of view, and there was not a lot of trading activity at the time, so I ended up doing some consulting for a few years before I came up with the idea for Texture. But as I said, we're one of We're one of a handful of broker-dealers here in the US licensed for digital asset securities, for primary offerings and secondary trading. If you want to get in touch with me, you can go to our website, www.texture.capital.
Thank you, Richard. Michael?
So I'm actually the non-JD in the group here. So actually, Richard, are you a JD?
I'm not no.
I couldn't remember. I always feel, like the
I didn't
only
want to
guy.
outnumber.
I
Equal
feel like the only
lawyer,
guy
non-lawyer
in the group
balance.
that's not like a lawyer, but I spent my entire career in tech as both a data architect and an entrepreneur prior to blockchain. In fact, I started on mainframes as an elementary school kid, in the late 70s. So I've seen all of the technology cycles, and it gives my crystal ball a lot of clarity because I know what to look for going forward in the future. And so I've had a number of firsts in my career. I led the team that won a Smithsonian Laureate Award for being the very first to ever connect a court case management system to the World Wide Web, courtclerk.org, Hamilton County, Ohio. It was the very first place that you could go on a browser and look up a case. And then a couple of years later, we invented the idea of online case initiation. So you lawyers don't have to get in your car and drive down to the courthouse to file. And so, continued to stay ahead of things adjacent to law and compliance automation. Spent about a decade in compliance automation after that. Then I saw the opportunities that were coming around blockchain. And the idea of tokenization is really what drove me. I didn't get into crypto. I dabbled in crypto, but it was nascent, and maybe I probably should have gotten into crypto, but I was more interested in the underlying technology itself and applying it to real-world use cases. And so now, as the CEO of 10xTX, we're actually in the process of merging our company into the Conduit network, CNDT.io, which is a decentralized physical infrastructure network. It's a hardware-based layer 0 that provides asset tokenization 2.0 for not just securities, but any other real-world asset. But the toe in the water is actually decentralizing cloud services. So anything that you can do on Amazon, AWS, or Azure, you'll be able to do across a physical infrastructure network that becomes, in essence, a mineable internet that everyone can own a share of and participate in and be rewarded for, which is kind of going back to the ethos and the values of the originators of the internet and the web, the early days of, it should be for everyone. It should be democratized, and it's been consolidated and centralized. And, there's a handful of companies that control the entirety of the internet in the world and all of the information, all of the traffic. And so returning to some of those types of values, it's an interesting exercise. I am finishing up a book right now that'll be published hopefully before Thanksgiving because I'd like to hit the holiday rush, but it's Digital Dividends. And it is a very comprehensive guide to real-world asset tokenization. So that'll be on Amazon, hopefully going into the holidays here. So yeah, CNDT.io, 10xts, 10xts.com, which is my current company. And so happy to always take calls and answer questions.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Michael.
David. Yep.
Larry?
Thanks, David. I've been a practicing security and funds lawyer for about 15 years, almost all of that within traditional finance, primarily in-house at large fund managers such as Blackstone, before moving full-time into this space during DeFi summer, what feels like much longer than 3-4 years ago. Oof. I've always been sort of like a techie person. I didn't have the pleasure of working with mainframes in the 70s, but I did get to play Pitfall on a Commodore 64 in my parents' basement on a 14.4 dial-up modem. So it worked. It's been interesting watching the space develop over all this time. I think we're really kind of hitting an inflection point on this. If you look at crypto adoption compared to the internet, we're kind of trending the same direction for uses, if not faster. And people outside of the digital asset space sort of look at us as a bunch of weirdos, but that's how they looked at all the people working with computers and the internet a few decades ago. So this just kind of feels like, I don't know, an excuse for me to be a weirdo, and I get to rationalize it away whenever I get weird looks at Thanksgiving, and I promise not to talk about Bitcoin or Ethereum at all. If people want to hear me ranting about regulations and screaming into the void, they're welcome to reach out to me or follow me on Twitter. My username's Larry Florio there. It's also the same thing on Telegram if you want to have more of an actual conversation. Like everyone else in the space, I'm pretty much always online. And yeah, if people are more interested in learning more about 1KX, our website's 1kx.capital. There's a game in there. You can mint your high score if you beat it, if you can find it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much to our attendees, and very much a personal thank you to the panelists who agreed to be here for the first webinar I've ever moderated. So I appreciate you all very much for being here, and I appreciate Financial Poise for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. You'll get the slides if you're attending, and they're our sponsors. So thanks to them for doing that. And with that, yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, David.